Okay, you mean to do the reading the questions? I saw one I can answer real quick.
Well, what if I want to read it?
Okay.
You do good at answering. I'll be your PR person.
For the record, while we're getting the videos going, everything, I think it needs to be noted that the men went longer in their small group than did the ladies. Not
That's
that
because the women were about to pop, including me.
No, we had a good session.
I had to go to the restroom.
Hope y'all did as well.
It was great.
I saw one that I was going to go.
Well, start at the top.
I bet he does have a remote too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he bought this really souped up remote that I don't like because it doesn't help me.
All right, we all back in? All right, first question. And these can continue to come in. There's the number. So
Make sure you put the area code.
yeah. So what was the quote we started with? It was a Tim Keller quote that says, Christianity doesn't give us what we want. It blows up everything we have to make room for something new. Okay? Second question, what were the 3 moves/ideas for the gospel waltz? It was repent, believe, and fight. And with that, I would encourage you to go to one of the early podcast interviews that we did with our pastor, Bob Flahart, who came up with this kind of metaphor of the waltz, the 3-step, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We interview him both on the gospel waltz, but also waltzing in marriage. How does the waltz show up in marriage? So there's 2 interviews that you can find with Bob Flahart. I point you toward our podcast to really he kind of unpacks the entire genesis of all of that.
Yeah, we love to podcast because it's like a free counseling session we get.
All right, how do you combat the feeling you need to please when you have set boundaries in place? I don't know if this is the same. Yeah, so first of all, Mel, why don't you start? How do you combat the feeling you need to please when you have set boundaries in place?
I think anytime we put a boundary in place, we're going to be challenged to follow through with that boundary or not. So whether that's pleasing, whether that's sobriety, whether that's control, whatever that looks like, think about it. When we put a boundary in place, you tell a 2-year-old, that they can't have the cookie, what are they going to do? They're going to throw a fit. And one of the things that I learned when I finally started putting some boundaries in place was some of the people let me take responsibility for this. Some of the people that I was letting take advantage of me now begin to not like that because I put boundaries in place. So I think until Jesus comes back, we're going to have this tension of, am I being true to myself or am I caving? And I'm definitely one of those that loves to please, needs approval and all that. So I have to do my own check with that. And if we're not careful, we can make it about the other person and begin to resent the other person. But the work is ours, correct? So that need to please, again, I've just kind of do that check. And it may even be that I caved. And now what do I need to do? I need to repent, believe, and fight.
Well, and sometimes I think giving ourselves permission to set boundaries. A lot of times we can buy into this idea that, let me just take you down the path of what I incorrectly believed. I started preaching in high school, as I shared. Galatians 2:20 says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ now liveth in me, and the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So as a young high school student who is now preaching, I interpreted that as, okay, I'm supposed to be dead in Christ, yes. But here I went further saying dead men don't have needs. I'm a dead man in Christ, therefore I'm not supposed to have needs, so I'm supposed to just meet everybody else's needs. And so then passive-aggressively, I was trying to get needs that I had denied in myself met by Melody passive-aggressively. Now, how messed up is that, right? So I think that first of all, just realizing that we all have needs. And with those needs, to get our needs met, at times it's going to require boundaries in place. And so I just want to validate the need for boundaries, but also, boundaries are not easy because, it'd be easy if we just set the boundary and everybody would abide by our boundaries. Mm-hmm. But when we set a boundary, if the other person is not used to that boundary, they're going to probably bump up against that boundary. And so to be able to hold on to ourselves, and even if it escalates in the conflict, if it's truly a boundary that we need, that hopefully that our boundary will be loved and respected and adhered to. And sometimes we may have to have others to help us with those boundaries. Sometimes we may need people helping us set boundaries. If we have lost a sense of voice, lost a sense of self, and don't really know what boundaries we need, maybe some of our brothers and sisters maybe can help us, with that, so we can begin to heal. So, how do you work through your own pain that could put fire on issues as a couple where the past addiction is known, but you don't realize it sends you to your own pain at times? And what I'm hearing in this question, a lot of times in couples, we have an enmeshed relationship. Now, enmeshment basically is when we're losing ourselves in the relationship. For a lot of Christians, that can appear or even come across as a healthy relationship. Take the marriage, the unity candle thing. You have two candles burning, one unlit, and then sometime during the ceremony, the husband and wife will come over, light the unity candle, and often they will blow out the individual candle, right? Signifying the two shall become one flesh, which sounds very godly, very biblical, and yes, the two shall become one flesh. But enmeshment is very unhealthy. The goal is differentiation. And so knowing who we are, standing on our own feet in Christ, man and woman, getting our needs met in Christ, now from that stable, differentiated place, now hopefully we can choose the relationship, not from a needy place. I described my story. I needed a relationship. I needed Melody to come through for me. So somewhere at the core of that was a selfish motivation to be in relationship with Melody. And I was expecting her to come through for me in certain ways. Again, selfish. So by being differentiated, now it may be that we have to do something, and maybe those boundaries, and if some things that we need to work on. What I hear in this is that what if that brings more conflict in the relationship?
And it usually gets worse before it gets better.
It does often. Because when we teach marriage, we talk about the unhealthy dance. Most of us have an unhealthy dance in our marriages. But it's the only dance we know. So we're kind of caught up in this dance. Well, guess what? When one person decides they no longer want to dance that way, and they begin to pull away and do something different, a lot of times the other partner's like, well, they're going to ramp up even more to kind of bring them back into the dance. And sometimes that's very, very hard to change the way of dancing with that. So I guess to answer this question is that a healthy marriage is made up of two healthy individuals. So if you are losing yourself in the relationship, but in doing that, you are denying things that you need individually. By doing the work individually and that healing work, you're going to show up more healthily, and it's going to lead to a more healthy relationship. Now, that may mean more conflict initially, because now you're maybe finding your voice and verbalizing what you need, and it may lead initially to more conflict, but it can also lead you to that new normal that you're hoping to have. So I'll stop at that for that one. I knew we were going to get this one. Do you believe masturbation is a sin?
I'll answer that.
All right, go ahead.
A couple different things, and I don't know, none of our answers are going to be black and white, okay?
Some of them might be.
Some of them might be, but so just a couple things to think about as we've walked with our kids, and Trey and I, coming back together, it was like we're a team. It's not Trey's job to talk to the boys, my job to talk to the girls. Things come up at any given point, and we just said, hey, we're a team. This is what we believe. One of us can run point on that at any given time. So there's a couple things. Having walked with women through this process, and yes, there's plenty of women that masturbate too that we walk with, so I don't want to try to make this gender specific. But I know for me, just related to boys. As we were raising our boys, I remember around the time of 5th grade, I was able to talk to my boys before entering 5th grade, and just started talking about what a nocturnal emission is, what a wet dream is, that is what the Lord allows to take place every 28 days by His design, so that you know later conversations that you will not blow up if you don't have sex, okay? It is not like air and water, all right? And then later, we were able to talk about self-control. Recently, I was actually talking to a counselor about how refraining, even in the context of marriage sometimes, like say a man pleases his wife and chooses not to get pleasured himself, that depending on the scenario, that can serve him well. Like say he was going in to do a sales presentation in front of a group of men. You know, not that just from a physiological situation, not having that orgasm could actually create additional testosterone to serve him well in a certain situation. Okay, you wouldn't want to go into a sales presentation like putty, like you are after an orgasm, right? So just using some of these examples, then being able to come back to a lot of the ladies that I walk with, when there is chronic masturbation, especially tied to pornography, you are now getting connected to a digital thing. And so I've actually had women who have come to me that says, my husband doesn't enjoy sex. He likes porn and masturbation. He doesn't like the human connection and the warm body and all that. And so again, that's another thing to just consider as we're having these conversations. And then masturbation is a form of self-sex. Yes, there's experimentation. Yes, there's curiosity. You know, we need to know, obviously going into marriage and things like that, what does please us. But we're talking about what is behind. That's kind of what I would want to ask the question is, what's behind the masturbation? Is it I'm stressed out? Is it I'm in pain and this is a release for that? You know, that maybe there are some other measures. I know Trey has said before that he can probably count on his hand the number of times that he has actually masturbated and not acted out. Okay?
Well, let me
because men are wired visually.
So the question, do you believe masturbation is a sin? Scripture is very, very silent. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say no masturbation, whatever. Obviously, lust is very clear, a sin. So the question, I think, is can you masturbate where there is no lust or the imagery or whatever that comes from that? So certainly lust is. The thing, I guess the deeper, and this is where what Melody is getting into, is the selfish nature of that. Yada, this beautiful gift of sex. Yada is the Hebrew word to know. Hebrew, and Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son. That word know is yada. And it's so much more elevated than what the culture says sex is. Culture, it's all about the orgasm and tips and techniques to how to enhance the orgasm. That's the pinnacle of sexual bliss in our culture. That is not the pinnacle when it comes to truly understanding yada. We have to remember God created this. And so the way we look at masturbation, whether you're single or married, because I, being single for 6 years, certainly was thrown into that. I was a virgin before Melody and I got married, but then had to learn how do I manage my sexuality when I'm single. And that's really a whole nother question. But it does involve this question of masturbation. And for us, as we deal with this in our own marriage, self-sex or masturbation is in some ways, the way we look at it, robbing from Melody, right? It's robbing the relationship of intimacy. It sometimes may be easier because, let's be honest, we may be avoiding vulnerability, right? I don't want to be vulnerable because if I approach Melody for sex, she could say no. That hurts. That's rejection. If it's all about just the orgasm and masturbation, then I can be done with that, and now she'll never even have to know. But yet it does impact our intimacy. It robs us of a connecting point. And it also looks at sex as a selfish thing. It's all about our pleasure rather than yada, this beautiful picture of husband and wife coming together as one and God being there, this holy mystery, union of worship is really what yada is about, not just the orgasm. And sometimes with masturbation, it really kind of puts the emphasis on just the pleasure aspect and certainly not the selfish giving. And I would just encourage you, if you're single, try to go a season, if masturbation has been a part of that, and you just kind of look at it, well, I'm single, I have no sexual outlet, so I'm just going to masturbate. I love how Michael John Cusick in his book, Surfing for God, he said, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. He said, I just know I've never felt stronger after masturbation. Usually it's like Melody's talking about the restraint and the self-discipline with not just doing maybe what comes naturally to do, does, kind of give us more testosterone or give us more energy to take care of those other responsibilities of life. It also forms discipline when we do get married, if that's in God's plan, to be disciplined in that relationship as well. So anyway, we kind of all around that question. How early on in recovery should he give his wife his disclosure? I would say fairly soon, because really in some ways she can't heal until she knows really what all she's dealing with.
However, too soon can be damaging as well, because just like an alcoholic who may not have any recollection of what took place the night before, because he was in a fog and doesn't recollect, that given some time frame to wait is good, because we have found that if a disclosure happens too early, that there may be details that he didn't remember that come later. And after a full disclosure, a staggered disclosure can be incredibly damaging. So we don't want it too early. What Trey usually does is he gives a guy a timeline so he can begin working through a process.
It's a template.
A template.
Yeah.
That is a timeline. And he can work through that and pray through that. And then he meets with Trey or a counselor. And then that disclosure is done with the counselor, with the party, because she's going to need to process that afterwards.
Yeah, and part of that is making sure there's not too many details that can be damaging, and just reading through it before the disclosure's done. We've sat in on many disclosures, and there's been a lot of very heavy stuff disclosed, but it's almost like ripping the scab off, quickly. It hurts, but yet now the healing can begin to take place. What Melody's describing, this staggered kind of the truth trickles out, can sometimes be healing starts and the scab gets knocked off again, healing a little bit, scab gets knocked, and it's kind of a start, stop. A full disclosure, that's usually a full disclosure where it's all out, and that can be terrifying, but that's our opportunity to get the secrets out and then to see if the relationship has a chance to survive. What is your experience with men as a betrayed party? How do they process the grief and PTSD symptoms differently? Recently, as we shared, we've been walking with a couple. We don't have a lot of experience. So I would not want to say that we are anyway experts in the way a male processes the trauma. I do know some ways it's different, and just with a male's ego and the way the betrayal cuts to, his manhood, with a straying spouse. I know there's that element, but in the same ways, maybe in a different way, that it cuts to a woman's woman. If I'd been more of a woman, if I'd been more whatever, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. The enemy is going to attack the identity. That's right. When that happens. Do you have resources for youth or teens trapped in sexual addiction? One of the things that I recommend is Fortify. For young people under 18, it's free. For older adults, it's very, very nominal as far as the cost. I know many fathers maybe go through it with their sons, or parents go through it with their daughters.
It's not gospel driven, right?
It's more of a brain science, but it's really, really good stuff. It's put out by Fight the New Drug. Many of you may have heard of. Now, full disclosure, Fight the New Drug, the founders are Mormon. Okay, so I want to be very clear with that. However, there's not Mormon faith, of any faith really, that's woven through their curriculum. It's really it's not a faith-based process. It's more of the brain science. But we found, and many of the young people and families that have gone through that have been very, very pleased and had good results.
Well,
with that.
and a lot of times I'll say if they can do Fortify with Michael John Cusick's book, Surfing for God, those are good because you've got the science with Fortify and then you've got the biblical design, God created desire. This is, part of my design and helps that process. Also, Unwanted by Jay Stringer is another book that we're promoting a lot. So,
all right, so this question, how do you really forgive? And I'm a man. So I guess that means this is a man asking a question, how do you forgive?
nobody can forgive without working through the pain. Okay? Otherwise, I'm going to call it fake forgiveness because we can't truly understand. And I believe forgiveness is really more letting go and surrendering to the Father to forgive through us. But we have to ready ourselves for that process, and we have to go through the pain before we can really be ready for that. And so to think that one day you're going to arrive at forgiveness without walking through the healing process and the pain of the process of whatever happened to you, it's really going to be hard. I have had women that, it happens and they forgive immediately, and it comes back to bite them in the fanny, years later or months later. So we really encourage, let's table forgiveness right now. Let's really work through this healing process, and then you're going to be in a really much better situation to be ready for that.
This question, when remarriage was on the table, was that decision mutually discussed, or was there a traditional proposal, or both? Can you talk a bit about that process and the time between that and the wedding? What kind of premarital counseling was needed? So let's just kind of go into this whole story, because I think this might be helpful for a lot of you. First of all, my biggest fear was hurting Melody again. Melody's biggest fear was being hurt again. If we were not in relationship, neither one of those fears could be realized. When we started even considering dating and began to date, now both of those fears were back on the table. So that's first thing. So as I share with the men in our breakout session, a big part of my journey alone is discovering who I was as a man. I needed to define myself as a man apart from the validation of woman. Okay? And so as I grew in that strength and began to realize who I was, it allowed me to now engage her from a more healthy way and really to have healthy conflict with her. Whereas before, because I always needed her approval, I was just the passive nice guy saying whatever I felt would kind of smooth things over the quickest. Well, that created a lot of insecurity for her. She didn't want just to hear what she wanted to hear. She wanted to hear truth. And I was too afraid of just sharing truth because of the conflict that might lead to. So it was like a marshmallow trying to sharpen marshmallow. I was just trying to buffer that rather than being the iron sharpening iron that I needed to be.
It's kind of like nailing Jell-O to the wall.
Yes.
It's very frustrating.
Creates insecurity. So that's kind of the backdrop. So as I began to understand who I was, there was an issue with parenting that was going on with our oldest daughter, where out of Melody's fear, and I get all this. She would, when the kids would go to my house early on, she would send them with books to read and all this stuff because she was terrified of what might be happening when they were at my house, right? And so that was going on. So my daughter was maybe 13 or 14, and I won't go into all the details, but anyway, there was a parenting thing where Melody, I knew, and her fear was basically putting our daughter in an adult situation.
Can I tell a story?
Kind of rough. If you want to tell.
So he's stepping into who he is, okay? And again, there's a lot of insecurity that's created when a man looks like he's strong and protector and all that, but he's a marshmallow. And so through this process of him doing the work, he started, standing up to me on things. And I was like, who does he think he is? You don't like it when people start putting boundaries in place. So it created some healthy conflict. So again, like Trey said, our daughter, and I think it was like a 2-piece, 1-piece issue or something like that. It wasn't like a sin issue, but I needed to be right.
Well, she and our oldest daughter had decided that she was only going to wear a 1-piece.
Because her body was budding and all that kind of stuff.
Which is fine. but I was not included in that conversation
True.
as the ex-husband. So I take the kids to the beach, and my daughter had left all of her bathing suits at home except one, and it was a little too small. So I took my daughter bathing suit shopping. Had a great time, father-daughter. Well, we looked for a one-piece. I mean, we looked for hours for a one-piece, and she wound up with a tankini, which is basically looks like a one-piece. But
No,
it's
it was a modest two-piece. That wasn't a tankini.
It was a tankini. I mean, yes. So
We're still
I've got
arguing
pictures
about
to
it.
prove it. So technically, two-piece looked like a one-piece, right? Well, the next day on the beach, our
This
daughter.
is why you have to do your work of trauma, because I was totally triggered in the fact that he took our daughter shopping for a two-piece. And it probably didn't matter if he said it was a one-piece that went to the ground. I would have heard bikini. You see what I'm
The
saying?
recovering sex addict is buying our daughter a swimsuit.
This
right?
is why it's important to
So that
do
was
your
the
work.
trigger that was behind all this. And so I buy the bathing suit. It is technically a two-piece, even though it looks like a one-piece. Well, the next day on the beach, our daughter didn't have a phone yet. This was how long ago it was. So Melody, she has my phone, and I hear Melody through the phone just really, hey, why did you buy a two-piece? We had agreed to buy a one-piece, and I finally had heard enough. I got the phone, I walked away, and I said, Melody, I'm her father, and I made the decision to buy the two-piece. I said, if there's an issue with that, you need to take that up with me and not our daughter.
So yeah, I was basically putting our daughter in the middle, which is never a healthy situation.
So 2 weeks later was Father's Day.
So Trey calls our worship
Hold on, before that.
pastor.
So here's when I knew it was what I feared. Her childhood is being robbed. She's now being put into a adult situation where she feels like she's made a bad choice, whereas I was there with her. So my Father's Day card was a homemade card from my daughter 2 weeks later. And basically she said, Dad, forgive me for making the bad choice about the bathing suit. And that's when I knew I had to deal with this. Now, me being the pleaser in the past, I wanted to please everybody. Well, here's a situation. I can't do right by my daughter. I need to fight for my daughter's heart, and that's going to mean total conflict with Melody. But I knew who I was now, and I could step into that healthy conflict. And so I said to you, when is your next appointment with your counselor? I'm going to be there.
Well, actually, you called the pastor, and he validated that Trey was, in the right. There was nothing wrong with what he was doing. I think you called like 3 or 4 people, again, just to bring them into the situation so he could recall that he was making a good decision. And again, what I'm motivated by at this point is fear. Fear, fear, fear. Not right, but fear. So he then says, when is your next counseling appointment? I want to be there. And I'm thinking, great, we're both going to kick your butt, because again, I'm self-righteous and I'm right and he's wrong, right? So again, not in this moment realizing that I'm motivated by fear. All I can see is he's not protecting our daughter. That was my vantage point. And it didn't matter if Jesus had told me, I was in the wrong. I don't know that I would have been able to hear it, because when we're in that lane, it's hard to hear anything different, okay? So we go in this counseling situation, and my counselor's like this big man, very much like my dad, just big man. He could pretty much get away and say anything to me. I just really respected him and loved him. And we're in there, and we're talking about all this, and I've got my arms crossed and my legs crossed, I'm sure, like this, on one end of the sofa, and Trey's on the other end. And we have the counseling appointment, and he goes out. And I'm going to be very raw and authentic here. And so my counselor, kind of leans forward to me, and he said, first of all, you are completely and totally in love with that guy. And I said, go to hell. I had gotten a little feisty at this point of the game. Recovery, you're swinging over here, and then you swing all the way over here. It's like the anorexic that gains like 50 pounds after they go to recovery. But then hopefully you end up back in the middle a little bit. So I was over here. I had found my voice. And so anyway, but what he then told me that I was very receptive of was, he said, Mel, you've got this scorecard. And he said, Trey is in a lose-lose situation. And he said, I don't know that you want that situation. And so he really just called me out on this scorecard, this trump card that I had. And it was like, Trey was in a no-win as long as I had that. And so he really began to share with me what he was seeing in this whole scenario. And it was very convicting. I can't say I was convicted in that moment, but as I left and processed that, I was like, wow. I didn't even realize I was doing it, y'all. I had no clue I was doing it. But once we're aware, we got to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
So that was a huge turning point.
So that was the fight that really, where she realized later on, she said, I never had.
I apologized too, didn't I?
Yeah, where you stood toe to toe with me like that. So I had, after her remarriage and I was freed to start dating, I dated 2 women. And I ended the relationship with the second one after about 8 months because her own codependency was coming up, and I just put dating on hold. And that's when I started the list I said earlier about Mrs. Right and all that. And I just quit dating. I didn't have a time limit on that. I just quit dating. And it wound up being about 9 or 10 months. And I had something happen at my home. I had to, a tree had fallen. I had to go to my insurance agent's house, business to get that all taken care of. And the woman who was handling my claim was single and attractive, and I started thinking maybe she's somebody I want to ask out. A buddy who kicked it, Sanford, he was a kicker, who's now my insurance agent, so I was asking him about her. He was a believer. And so Melody and I were getting along at this time enough just as co-parents and co-adults, and to the point that I had even invited her to go on a beach trip with me and the kids. This is another beach trip, not the one with the bathing suit. And so she declined. She did not go.
We really were getting along at this point. We had really started co-parenting well. He could come over. I would let him inside at this point, and he would help the kids do homework, and we were like really engaged. And so it was hard because I kind of just know BFF land. So I was like, how do I do this, and how do we co-parent and do all this? And let me inject, before the house fell on your fence,
a tree fell on my fence.
Yeah. Yes, that.
Tornadoes.
The tree fell on your fence. There were 2 opportunities that Trey really brought out the word reconciliation. And just, have you ever considered this? And I think the first time I was like, no, we've got a great situation going. We could show up at games. We can go to movies with kids, blah, blah, blah. I just knew that this was working, so why mess this up? Like, we don't have to get into the personal relationship piece. We're doing a great job. And then I think December, you mentioned again, and then February is when you went to the beach with the kids.
Yeah, so I was at the beach. I'd asked her to go. She declined. And so I'm just talking to her. And like I would talk to a friend, I just told her I'd met somebody that I was thinking about asking out.
And I said, ready, fire, aim.
She said, what do you mean?
Are you kidding me? Like, you just mentioned 2 months ago about reconciling with me, blah, 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 blah. And I went on this
So
rant.
she does not have a good
totally
poker
told on
face
myself.
at all. So she completely gave herself away as to what she was really thinking. And so I brought the kids back to her house that Sunday night, and we put the kids down. And afterwards, I asked her permission to pursue her again. And it was scary for both of us.
Actually, what you did was when I kind of started on this rant, I'm always right. No, just kidding. Well, no, I remember these moments because they were breakthrough moments for me of where I was still like, had a little ice on the outside, and Trey would do something to thaw everything. And so you mentioned reconciliation, and I think I said again, like, we've got a great thing going or whatever, and he bear hugged me. And he said, I will wait forever if you will give me the chance to reconcile. And I know this is not going to be easy, and I know it's going to be really hard. But you have a counselor, and I have a counselor, and I just want to see if there's a possibility here. And so it was another moment where I was just like, facing my fear and my pain and all those things. But I knew God was at work. I just didn't know what it looked like. Of course, then you're thinking, my dad's going to kill us. He's going to kill you. He's going to, because again, when there's addiction, there's such a wake, and there's so many people that it impacts. And so we actually we went to our counselor like the next day or the next week or whatever, and he just encouraged us to kind of keep it just between the 2 of us initially, because obviously if our kids had gotten wind of it and it didn't work out, we sure didn't want them to have to go through anything again. So
yeah, that was kind of tricky, having to figure out how to date, see if it could work without bringing the kids into that. So we're learning how to be authentic and honest, and then it felt like we were hiding again, in a sense. But it was for a good.
You're running around behind your children's
That's right.
yes,
Exactly.
yes,
Yes. Very well said. So anyway, that's a
then
longer.
you drove to my parents' house, I
Yeah.
think the weekend before that, maybe even, and just where he was doing a lot of things that obviously nobody was asking and stuff like that, which were signs to me that like there's
Well, it's
some
part of
real-
my own amends process in my recovery. But anyway, God did a tremendous work there, and the longer answer probably but that does kind of fill in some of the gaps. We had some people say, "Oh, y'all just taking the easy path and getting remarried." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" Nothing easy about that, because again, we both were stepping toward our biggest fear. That was a big scary part.
Well, and what was interesting is like we'd have these like great conversations. He'd come over and help the kids or whatever, and put the kids to bed or whatever. And then we'd have this like great conversation, and then I'd be like MIA for like 4 or 5 days because I was
Yeah.
freaking out.
It became a cycle. I'd be on the way home after a great conversation. Well, probably won't hear from her until Thursday, And sure enough, and again, for her, can you imagine, those good conversations, she would be freaking out. What in the world am I doing? And the wall would go back up. Yeah. There was, rightly so, a lot of fear in that, because I had historically hurt her not once, twice, but multiple times. Let's see. In your biblical view, do you believe watching porn is the equivalent to adultery? This is a hotly debated topic. Let me first of all answer it this way. We walk with a lot of churches, and the question comes up when we're walking with churches who are walking with a couple who maybe there's been an issue of pornography, no adultery, and the elders are trying to make a church decision about biblical grounds for divorce. I would have a hard time coaching or consulting with a church to say, yes, there's biblical grounds for pornography. Now, there's different stages of that. Pornography, that's a whole big deal. And there may be different parts of that would not be the case. Obviously, child pornography and some other things that could be in that thing. But let's just say pornography, because I think it sets a precedent. We start saying there's biblical grounds for divorce with the pervasive nature of pornography. But at the same time, let's go on the other side of what it does to the marriage. The betrayal trauma, when we say sometimes, well, it was just porn, but to really understand the damaging effect, because we have a lot of couples come to us, well, if just my husband or I, or just my wife and I, is porn okay? That's another question we get. And our big answer is it introduces so much to compare in the relationship. It robs so much of the innocence because there's nothing really real in pornography, and so now you've got all these comparisons that are in your head that really are not based in reality, but yet it's there, and now it's causing discontent in the relationship. It may be physical discontent with the way your spouse looks. It may be, stamina. I mean, that's a big lie of
you can't last
pornography.
4 hours.
Yeah, like, there's stamina for, 4 hours because, again, you don't know when all the cuts are happening. It looks like one big take, but that's the message of pornography, which, again, that comes in, and there just becomes a lot of discontent that the enemy, marriage is already hard enough without all of those things brought in.
I do think that there are measures to be taken, and actually Covenant Eyes, who I know a lot of people have that accountability software. There was an article a number of years ago that Luke Gilkerson, who we love and respect, and is a theologian, he actually wrote on pornography and divorce, and it was very interesting. I would read it just from the perspective of all the things he went down into the Greek and the Hebrew and all that, and really kind of made a case that in certain circumstances, that may be something that you need to do. Again, we don't really try to point either way or not, but we do say that sometimes a healing separation can be very helpful to let both parties heal. So there's not this clear-cut answer, but I don't know that, a woman has been called to live in constant neglect and pain for 20, 30 years ongoing if somebody is choosing willfully not to get well.
Well, and that's a good point. If it's a situation, because most of who we're working with are people who are trying to overcome pornography. If there's a situation where somebody's married to someone who's not struggling with pornography, they are, willfully indulging in pornography, not even trying to hide that, then I think you could biblically make the case for abandonment in that case, and going to pornography and robbing, so much of the intimacy in the marriage relationship. So I think, so that's a distinction there. Pornography that is habitual and there's not even trying to change. This is what I'm going to do, get over it kind of attitude. That's much different from somebody who is struggling. Maybe they were exposed as a child and it's been a part of their life. They're trying to gain victory. But they're slipping, from time to time. To me, that's two different situations that I think to distinguish there. Do you recommend marriage counseling and individual counseling for the couple, or marriage counseling following individual work? I would say first, if you want to go ahead.
I was going to say individual first,
Yes.
because so many times when you go into couple counseling, that's what you're doing, and we've got to kind of pull the parties apart so that both individuals can do individual healing, because a coupleship is only going to be as healthy as you are individually. And I just know how the enemy hunts. It's so much easier to look in Trey's yard than it is my yard, right? And so couple counseling is like, well, he's got, individual counseling that allows me to take a long look in the mirror with another party present to really begin to dissect and find out what are my go-tos, what do I need to repent of? And there's just a lot of calmness and things that I can do individually with somebody than have to bring it all in. So we actually are a little bit different than maybe some recovery ministries. We say individual first, and then that can make room for coupleship.
Think about it this way. Your individual recovery or individual work with a therapist, you now individually go into your own brokenness. Part of that work for me, when Melody would cock an eyebrow a certain way and I'd feel shame, whatever, when I didn't do my own individual work, I just knew that she was doing something that I didn't like and she just needed to stop. So there could be no healthy communication about that because I didn't have the proper self-awareness to be able to articulate what was going on inside of me when she did that, when she used a tone or whatever. Well, I now have done the work to know that when she cocks her eyebrow or uses that tone, it takes me back as a wounded little 8-year-old boy who's in trouble, and I feel like a parent-child relationship, and the shame comes out. Well, now I can articulate that, and I don't have to assign intent to her to do that. But in the past, before I was aware of all that, I just knew it's her fault, and if she'd stop, we're good, right? And so the individual work enhances the communication in the coupleship. Because the more we get in touch with our own stuff and be able to articulate our own inner dialogue and our own inner angst and all that stuff, now there's much more raw material to show up in the coupleship. It's almost like now both individuals are in motion and the couples counseling is steering two ships in motion rather than trying to create inertia. Because if you come in and you're both totally unaware of your own individual family of origin stuff and all that, you try to do couples counseling, it's got to be a really good therapist to try to ask some really good questions to try to get this thing going. Right. But usually, so anyway, longer answer probably than you needed. But
well, especially when there's a betrayed spouse, that betrayed spouse has got to get to safety. And if their partner is the one that's created the trauma, how are they going to get to safety if they're in the room with the person that hurt them? So do you see how that could be more problematic than helpful?
So this is a good question. How much detail is appropriate for an addicted father to share with his children, whether of young years, teen years, and adult years? Great question. I would say, I think in most cases, less is more, because the details can be very, very harmful. And I will point you to the interview we did with Dan Allender on this question, because he answered this from a clinical perspective, that often it can be very problematic if we are kind of just unloading a lot of the details of our story as adults on our children, no matter what age our children. Certainly it can be damaging if our children are very young. That's why, as you heard some of you last night, when we disclosed to our children, it was in very age-appropriate ways. What they could understand, when we divorced, and then as they got older, we brought them more up to speed, which again, it was age appropriate.
But I also will say too that sometimes what can be very beneficial and even redeeming some of your brokenness is to be able to say to your kids, like say you're asking them to put some boundaries around their relationship that they may have with their girlfriend or boyfriend, to be able to bring in some of those stories of maybe this happened to me when I was dating somebody, or, this is why I want you to do that, and to be able to share some of those things. Because again, they need perspective sometimes on why we are parenting the way we are parenting. And so again, just bringing in some of those perspectives and things like that. I think our kids were 11, 10, 8, and 6 when you told them that you committed adultery. It's a couple years later that you actually told them what you did.
Yeah. All right, so this may be more a question for Trey, but could be for both. Your stories seem a bit matter-of-fact and even self-centered. Trey, can you describe better the emotions involved and others-centered your mental focus came to be factors? Your stories seem a bit matter-of-fact, even self-centered. Trey, can you describe better the emotions involved and others-centered your mental focus came to be factors? So I guess the emotion, some of that maybe we've covered. This was one of the earlier questions that came in, and maybe even in talking about our reconciliation, because I think there were more emotion that came in that. And I do apologize, sometimes in a condensed format, there has to be kind of a matter of fact. And so we're taking a very messy story, and by retelling it, it can come across as very, even the messy story can kind of seem more neat and tidy than it was, because one of that's just a time constraint and not going into all the nuances. So I think what they're getting at in this question is maybe the emotions. Yeah, because it's also others-centered and self-centered. So sometimes recovery can feel very self-centered. And there's part of that is we're going into our own stuff, and it can over time become navel-gazing in as well. I think that's one of the beautiful things about the 12 steps is that 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. We then in turn take this message to other addicts of whatever sort, so that they can, so there's that kind of others focused in that. So it's kind of this, we kind of go into our own stuff, but not to stay there, so that we can then become others focused. And really, I think it's discipleship, really. I think to be a good discipler is knowing yourself, and then you can now walk with others effectively in that. And I think the process of the steps of making amends is a process of being others focused and really owning, and I think even grieving how our behavior, how our actions has negatively impacted someone else. And again, that takes a lot of work on our shame, because if shame is still alive and well, we can't do that well, because every time we admit any kind of weakness, it takes us to that place of shame, and we don't react very well. When we can begin to remove shame from the behavior, we now can more healthily deal with and own the behavior without it taking us to that place of shame. On that same front, there's 3 guys right now in my small group, 2 of which are dealing with some of the same dynamics. Their wives and some of the trauma of the betrayal and stuff they're going through, they haven't done as much work. They're not really as involved as the men are in the recovery process, unfortunately. But what's happening in both of those men is the wife is used to a shame response from her husband. And now that the husband is getting healthier, he's no longer giving her the same shame response. He's actually healthier. But she's expecting the historical shame response, and both spouses, independent of each other, have described it as arrogance. Haughty and arrogance is how they're describing really their husband in a more healthy way, who's no longer going to that place of shame. Okay? And so they're struggling because these men want harmony and peace in the relationship, and so they're tempted to begin to respond more from that shame place, because that's what she's looking for. And so my work with them, which really seems counterintuitive at times, is to continue to show up in their own strength, understand and validate the pain, try to speak to the fear behind that. But going to a shame place is not helping either one of them. It's certainly not helping him in his recovery. So again, I'm kind of tying that into this this others focused as well. So anyway, I hope I may have totally missed that question, so I apologize if I did. All right, so as a military member, I have free secular counseling for our marriage and for individual for each of us, but I'm afraid of not having that Christian-based help if we attend it setting us down the wrong path. But we can't afford Christian counseling and it's not covered, but we know we need help. Sorry for the long, okay. I would say any counseling is better than no counseling. God, I think now there's some bad therapists, let me say that. I don't speak for all the therapists out there, and certainly some secular ones that, but I think there's enough, let me put it this way, there's enough people here that you can trust that can put you maybe on the list of providers that are covered that maybe can help point you in the direction of the better alternatives for your counselors. But here's the thing, with your counselor, if you're seeing a clinician, and Adam Calvert, who does our Embark Intensive, he makes this distinction. He is a counselor who is a Christian, okay? So he's been clinically trained, but he obviously brings his Christ-centered focus to that. So there may be some quote-unquote secular counselors who are not promoting themselves as Christian counselors who are Christian, okay, in this area. So I would say, again, have some other people help you maybe make those recommendations. If you've got maybe the pastor here, I know there's other people who are very versed in this. I know there's some opportunities here at the church that you may look at as well.
Well, and secular or non-secular, I think a good counselor can help you get behind the roots of what's driving your behavior, who can help you begin to understand and unpack past pain, and so that can serve you well to go to that, but then you can also utilize the shepherds and the pastoral care here in the church to bring that spiritual component. So it doesn't have to just be either or, it could be both and. Just a thought.
All right, did either of you have habits that the other could not stand? How did you get past those?
Okay, so one of mine that he hates, I squeeze the tube of toothpaste in the middle, and it goes all over the tube. I'm a free spirit, so
And she doesn't
sometimes
put the
I
cap
might.
back on.
Nope, I don't put the cap back on.
And it all gets dried, and then
so
you
we
put
have
it.
2 tubes of toothpaste.
That's right. Solved.
That is a solved
Problem
situation. I can be super clean and neat, and my closet looks amazing, and then he can walk into the bathroom, and there can be 12 outfits on the floor. So he's just learned to expect that. Sometimes I'll say, if I was organized all the time, I'd be so boring.
And she would.
So part of the process is we have learned, just like before you got married to whoever your spouse is, you loved certain things about them. And then after marriage, some of those things that you love, rubbed you raw, right? So you got to take the good, the bad, and the ugly. That doesn't mean that sometimes we don't compromise. Trey can load the dishwasher way better than I. He thinks that the dishwasher is for sanitizing dishes. I think the dishwasher is for cleaning the dishes. So again, you're going to do things
So
different.
I may empty the dishwasher. There's clunks of chicken or whatever else still in the dishwasher. How many agree that you just need to get all that off?
You just
Okay.
you just keep that plate in there a couple more
That's right.
runs, right?
Now let me.
There's not one way to do things.
Well,
And I have learned that the more we let our kids learn, we call it failing forward successfully.
That's right. Well, let me go a little bit more into a marriage thing here. We believe marriage is difficult and difficult by design.
Yep.
And when we get that perspective, a lot of problems in marriage can be solved. Because I think the enemy uniquely hunts when we have this idea that it's not supposed to be this hard. And then we start having these thoughts of maybe I just married the wrong person. Or maybe I married the wrong personality. Or maybe I married the wrong temperament. Or maybe they're just using everything they can just make my life miserable. But to give you the perspective that God is uniquely using all the stuff of your spouse
And your kids.
to bubble up stuff in you that he wants to bubble up. So while you may not change your spouse, the question is, how might God be using my spouse to bring to the surface things that he wants to bring to the surface? because that's what we can control and working on that. So I just think just throwing that in, a little freebie from our Perfectly Imperfect Marriage stuff. All right, so some of these came in from last night too. So how do you deal with the guilty until proven innocent accusation issue post-betrayal? Great question. This happens a lot because obviously, and one thing, let me say this principally, is we have found that God has a way of bringing us back to the same crossroads that we were at maybe in the past, but for different results. Sometimes we can feel shame, though, believing the lie, we shouldn't be back at this crossroad. But the perspective we have now is we now see that we're responding differently to this same set of circumstances, which then signifies growth. That we're not the same two people that dealt with this before. We're responding differently to that. Triggers are a real thing post-betrayal. And so I think if you are the betrayer in the relationship and you're walking your path and you're getting healthy and you're no longer that person, a lot of changes has taken place, still it's a gift to your spouse to allow them to be triggered. And again, it's back to once the shame begins to heal, when Melody is triggered, I don't necessarily take that personally because I understand she's not choosing to be triggered. It's not like one day she said, okay, at 2 o'clock this afternoon, I'm going to be triggered just to make Trey miserable. No, it comes out of left field. And one of the things in our marriage, too, we realized is when we got remarried, it would have been great if we just took a long extra week time and let's just go off to a cabin somewhere and let's just deal with everything, put everything on the table, deal with it once and for all and be done with it. That was not an option. You know why? Because that assumes that we know exactly where all the hurts and hang-ups that we've stored over the years are located, and we're just going to now go unpack them and bring them to the surface. That's not how it works. It's a trigger that comes out of left field that brings all that stuff to the surface like a volcano. Now, early on, when we first remarried, we were like, wait, how do we avoid all this? And we finally realized, you know what? It's not about avoiding. It's like, here it is. We now have new tools to deal with it. Whereas we used to spend so much time and energy beating ourselves up for being back in that place. But now we realize, no, being back in this place gives us an opportunity to use the tools that we're now using and have different results than we used to have. And so, long answer, but just to be able, the guilty until proven innocent will not last forever. That's where she is right now. And if you're that spouse and maybe it has been 10 years and you're still guilty until proven innocent, some of that may be that you're expecting, maybe to stay stuck and that he or she just needs to respond a certain way to keep you okay. And both of you need to be moving forward.
And
toward healing.
sometimes, again, probably a couple years after we got remarried, Trey there'd be moments where if our kid was having a issue or I was triggered or whatever, Trey would just go back to that place and he'd say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I remember our son, our oldest son, in his teenage years, he seemed to push all my buttons. And so I would tap out a lot of times and be like, Trey, you need to run point on this or I'm going to kill him. And Trey would there were a couple times I remember literally in our bedroom, Trey would look at him dead square in the eyes and he'd say, do I need to ask for forgiveness again? And our son would be in this posture of his, and then all of a sudden you'd see his little lip quiver. And it was just that moment, where he would soften. Or Trey would say the same thing to me. Baby, I'm so sorry. I caused that. And again, if he hadn't done the work, he's going to be like, that was 4 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever that is. Like, buck up, buttercup. But he didn't do that. He would just enter into that place with me. And that is that continued healing that is needed. And so I just encourage you that those places are like moments in time that can really create ongoing healing.
Well, part of that, we can fight at the surface level. When it's a tit for tat thing, we can fight at this surface level. But when we get rid of the scorecard and the tit for tat goes away, we can dive beneath the surface to what's really going on. And so I think if you are the betrayer, back to this question, and the spouse is still that guilty until proven innocent thing, that's at the surface level, whatever that circumstance in that moment. But to be able to speak to the deeper hurt and like Melody said, sometimes it's just using that as another opportunity to say, I'm sorry again, for a deeper repentance. You know, sometimes I'll say to Melody when she's triggered by things that she would not ever be triggered by if it hadn't been for our history. You know, sometimes I just say, I am so sorry that because of my past sin, that's even an issue for you. You know, and again, I know who I am in my identity. I've made mistakes, but the shame is no longer attached to that, which now I can hold on to myself and give her the gift of being triggered and work through it without losing myself in that. When there's shame and that enmeshment, we can't give our spouse the gift of that because we need them to be a certain way so that we'll be a certain way. And when we're differentiated, we can give our spouse the space to be wherever they need to be and it not take us under. And if it does take you under when your wife or husband is however way, then we probably have an enmeshed situation at some level going on, right? And we need to talk more and look at more what differentiation might look like. I think that may be it.
What?
So we are a little bit early. I think we were shooting.
We're 3 minutes early.
Oh, is that? I saw. Well, 4 o'clock is what the thing said.
No,
So.
it says 3:45.
Okay. So closing
remarks. That would be
We got 3 more
Lanny.
minutes for closing remarks.
Or Rick.
But guys, let me just say how grateful we are. And I'm so glad we're getting this recorded and all of that, because this is going to be, we're able to do a lot more here. And we shared this with your staff even before we had last night's session because of the culture that has already been created here. Yep. And so it's such a gift to us to be able to go to something. There's a lot of what we've shared that we rarely get to share because it's very obvious you guys are going to get it because you've already there's a lot of ground that's already been plowed. So I just want to say thank you for that. Look forward to being back with you guys in the service in the morning. It won't just be a recap of our message. We'll get into the Word and just bring out some of these themes as it relates to the Christian walk. So we appreciate it and have had a great time with you guys.
Hope we haven't overwhelmed y'all. No, this has been great. It's
All right,
been
I think
really,
that's
really
it.
good.
Would you please say to this larger group what you told the smaller group last night about the future of pornography in the nations being called in to help?
Yes. So one of the slides we had last night was I believe that easy access to internet pornography is one of the main hindrances to the advancement of the gospel worldwide. And what I know about our Heavenly Father is He's not wringing His hands about this issue. He's actually using it to introduce men and women to a deeper understanding of grace and the gospel. So the idea that we've been having for a number of years, many countries who are closed to the gospel are open to people coming in to teach English, right? So many missionaries in closed countries go in teaching English, but really they're there for missionaries, right? To be missionaries. So an idea that has birthed in our head, wouldn't it be just like God that countries that are closed to the gospel, but yet who have a tremendous porn epidemic, that maybe missionaries are coming into that country to help with the porn problem and being missionaries that way. Instead of teaching English, they're helping with that particular issue. And so we have seen, as we've been doing recovery groups, we've got 160 men who've come through our 4-day intensive, that what if God may be using some of them to steward their scars in such a way to actually be a redemptive instrument of righteousness even overseas in a different culture, but a culture that the common denominator is that they are struggling and need answers. Like India, for instance, India said even 3 years ago, hey, we don't need more money to build churches. We need help getting our pastors off of pornography. That's kind of the epidemic and where we are. So.
What you've heard this weekend is beauty from the ashes. And as each one of us is set free, we become that representative of that message to another audience. So this has This has major consequences for all of us as we continue to come out of the darkness and into the light. Father, we're so grateful to you for the opportunity to get serious and focused and understand. And now we're asking for your grace to attend us as we move forward into this uncharted territory as a people group. And also, Lord, for the courage to face the things that we have kept hidden. We believe that you are our redemptive Father. You have given us a healing culture, that we are a people who do not throw people away because they fail, that you have granted to us a sense of compassion and grace and perseverance. Allow this atmosphere of hope, Lord, to begin to vibrate with the intensity of your presence, to release us, Lord, into the destiny to which you appointed each of us before we were born. I bless these, Lord, and all they represent, and we look forward to the celebration of victory tomorrow morning, to even this evening, as we walk away chewing on the things to which we have been exposed. We bless you for the opportunity. We thank you for the promise of a future, and we bless your holy name. Amen. You're dismissed.